This is a huge, enormous catalyst for Tao because behind the scenes on every bridge, in order to buy a subnet token, you have to buy Tao first. It's amazing in the history of capitalism because I would say this is the first time someone's made a piece of code, a platform that perfectly represents in the digital world what the free market is.
OpenAI announced a week or so ago that you can no longer ask medical questions and you can no longer ask for financial advice. AI that can actually be far more disruptive and transformative because it's built by the collective of humanity as opposed to 20 people in Palo Alto or 50 people in San Francisco. I think there's going to be new power structures in the world at the government level, at individual levels. And I think if you're not educating yourself very seriously and questioning the sort of structure of the existing systems, you're going to be left out.
Well, first off, JJ, so I feel like every time we talk, there are more catalysts than ever for Tao, at least more catalysts that I'm starting to see, and less worries. So we've conquered my worries a long time ago about the value of alpha tokens. And I think that was episodes 3 through 6. And we talked about, the halvening and things like that. But I think a huge catalyst for Tao coming out is that it's very hard right now to buy the subnet tokens. There's only one way to do it. It's essentially get a Tao wallet, buy Tao, and then stake into the subnets. And just for people who are listening for the first time, you could think of the subnets as basically startup companies that are doing amazingly well because they're using the full resources of the Bittensor or Tao platform. But JJ, you were telling me how you're even building bridges between the different exchanges to the subnet token so that it becomes easier to buy. This is a huge, enormous catalyst for Tao because behind the scenes on every bridge, in order to buy a subnet token, you have to buy Tao first. Even if you're not aware that you're buying Tao, because how the bridge works, you have to buy Tao. The exchange has to buy Tao. And that creates enormous buying pressure. So as companies or subnets like Ridges start achieving success, or Sports Tensor or Targon or whatever, as they start achieving success and investors want to invest in the subnet tokens, and the more exchanges that offer it, the more they will be bought. That means the more Tao will get bought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly correct. Bittensor today is not as widely accessible and easy to get exposure to as a retail investor as, say, Bitcoin or Ethereum. The options for mainstream consumers today are mainstream exchanges like Binance, Coinbase, Kraken, and others. And those are sort of like general purpose cryptocurrency exchanges. Interestingly, I actually noticed the other day, I was looking at Kraken. You can actually also buy stocks on Kraken. So you can buy like Apple and Nvidia and stuff. And so I think there's going to be at some point a sort of blurring of the lines between crypto and stocks in terms of mainstream retail platforms and tools. I imagine you'll be able to buy Bittensor alpha tokens on Robinhood someday or through Charles Schwab. Part of what I think enables that, like you mentioned, are these bridges and sort of integrations. Latent Holdings is the company that I started about a year ago with Cameron Fairchild. Cameron's kind of the core maintainer, core contributor of Bittensor. Has been involved since almost the very beginning. He was one of the first miners in early 2021. Our team has been building VTAO or virtual Tao, which is essentially a wrapping staking solution for Tao itself. You can have access to that from any exchange like Coinbase or Binance that supports EVM-based contracts. And so if you're familiar with Ethereum, the closest equivalent to something like this in the context of Ethereum would be something like Lido or wrapped stake Ethereum. And what that allows is just like this fungible kind of extension point for Tao across all these other chains. So you'll be able to access and expose your assets from all these other EVM supported chains into Tao. So you can buy Tao from Base, you can buy it from Arbitrum, you can buy it from all the layer 2s from Solana directly. And then what we're also releasing is virtual Tao. That's coming out pretty soon. And you'll be able to get the same types of capabilities that you could see from VTAO for the alpha tokens. And then what we think that will allow is just a lot more liquidity and access into the subnet ecosystems from stablecoins and from other chains where there happens to be quite a lot of liquidity. I mean, there's a lot of liquidity on Solana, there's a lot of liquidity on Ethereum, and we just want to make it dead simple for people to have trusted access to these technologies. There's a lot of these bridges that are popping up. And something I pointed out on Twitter a few days ago is that most of them are hacked together. They're not audited. They're not fully open source. And they're not built by people who have been trusted already for many years to ship production quality software that, our whole ecosystem relies on. And so I'm not going to name names, but I'll just highly, highly recommend people be extremely careful. We don't charge any fees for VTAO. We also do not plan on charging fees for virtual TAO. They're all fully open source. They're audited by Zelic. We're planning on adding many layers of audits, third-party audits. And our platform is based on layer 0. We think is the most scalable and fee-efficient message passing infrastructure for basically supporting all of the other ecosystems and chains that are out there. And so that's kind of one thing. I think you're right. I think it will be a catalyst for more capital inflows coming into the Bittensor ecosystem.
Yeah, because I was looking recently, apparently in the past few weeks, the market cap of all the subnets added together has gone from about $1 billion to $1.5 billion. So a 50% increase. And that's without any of these bridges, without any breakout success from the subnets. We know there will be breakout successes, but they haven't fully captured the public's imagination yet. And when you and I were last together in Canada, we knew of at least one subnet that was getting calls from VCs, but not even returning the calls because the Tao incentive mechanism sort of provides everything you need rather than selling your soul to a venture capitalist. And so these subnets are just at the tipping point where they're getting noticed, and yet it's still a 50% increase in market cap on them just in the past few weeks. I think that's why Tao, out of the top 100 crypto tokens, is the best performing. That and Zcash are the best performing two tokens since the flash crash, which happened exactly 1 month ago today, October 10th. Again, if there's a breakout success, which there will be, and imagine if you can now easily go to Coinbase or any of the centralized exchanges or Uniswap on Ethereum or anything and easily buy the subnet tokens just by looking it up and hitting click. The market cap of the subnets is going to quadruple, which means Tao could multiply by 8 from here. And you won't even know people are buying Tao. They're buying the subnet.
Exactly. It's just an implementation detail and a liquidity bridge, essentially. You can think of Tao as just the reserve currency as an incentive for all of the subnets. And from a retail trader perspective, if you're hearing about Ridges, you're hearing about Targon or one of these subnets, and you're just like, wow, this team built an incentive for people to compete with CoreWeave. CoreWeave's worth $60 billion, and they're aggregating compute more efficiently. It's secure. It's got confidential compute enabled, right? They've got all the top chip options available on this network. Man, it seems undervalued. I might want to get some exposure to something like that. Ridges, they're building coding agents. Coding agents are arguably the most profitable and fastest growing AI products getting built today. Most estimates put around half of Anthropic's revenue in the coding agent category. So Claude and Cursor, because Cursor is primarily based on Anthropic's APIs. And, that's something on the order of 5 or 6 billion a year in revenue.
And almost if you add the two companies together, almost $200 billion in valuation. And Ridges actually has a better AI model than both companies.
Yeah, this is really just starting to become more widely known. I think capital efficiency in AI is probably the most under-discussed sort of like imminent repricing event on the horizon. I think that even Jensen and actually Sam Altman was tweeting a few days ago about OpenAI, like maybe wanted to compete with CoreWeave. Why would they be competing if they needed all the GPU compute? They're signing $1 trillion of contracts. There's a mismatch and there's a sort of a contradiction in that if they needed the tens of gigawatts of compute, every possible cycle of those GPU compute resources they're buying, why would they be considering building a cloud service and renting out the compute to the ecosystem? It's obviously revealing a fundamental mismatch with their capital expenditure plans in terms of resourcing for inference or training when they actually may not need to be doing that. And so I also think what Bittensor is revealing is that there's just going to be more efficient ways of building the AI that will end up just leapfrogging and being state of the art in so many domains. And we've already seen China do this with the open models. The vast majority of the open models are Chinese models, and the vast majority of the models being used by startups in the United States are open models. And so they're being used and sort of fine-tuned heavily because when they're trained in China, it's sort of like politicized, right? You can't ask about Tiananmen Square. You can't ask about, very polarizing political topics in China where they actually censor your speech and censor what you can say. And so there was actually a really hilarious, someone was asking Cursor's coding agent, what it thinks about like some Chinese censored topic. And the model was like, sorry, I refuse to kind of provide information on this topic. And so it was pretty obvious, like Cursor was using a deep sea fine tune that they forgot to sort of like uncensor properly. But the innovation is coming from open source. Bittensor amplifies this and turbocharges it because it creates a sustainable incentive system for rewarding anyone permissionlessly on the planet to contribute to this. What I think a lot of people don't understand is how do you actually provide a sustainability mechanism for open source? DeepSeek was subsidized by a hedge fund. They were printing money, speculating and making trades on market changes like hedge funds do, long short hedge funds. And they were generating a lot of profits on those trades. A big part of the trade, which is from January of this year, which seems like an eternity ago, was we're going to build a disruptive state-of-the-art model for reasoning, release it for free as open source, and it's going to freak out everyone in the West, all these labs that are claiming that they need another $100 billion to build a better reasoning model. And of course, the result was, if people forget, as a reminder, $500 billion was wiped out of the markets in about 6 hours the morning after. I believe they released it over a weekend, and then I think the following Monday is when the big market correction happened. And of course, they were able to make an asymmetric trade on that, and it probably made $5 or $10 billion. The big difference with Bittensor is you don't need to short a market reaction on open innovation. You can just directly subsidize the open innovation, and the network itself is looking for that. It's intrinsically looking for more open innovation, more capital efficient innovation. And it's really for the first time in the history of capitalism that a technology infrastructure exists that can allow anyone on the planet to participate in accelerating open source innovation and actually get paid to do that. It's really profound that Bittensor makes this possible. For the same way that Bitcoin incentivizes a more and more secure digital ledger for deflationary ultrasound money, right? To use one of the phrases, incentivizes people to run a cryptographic hash. Bittensor is doing this to incentivize anyone to create open source, permissionless, continuously improving intelligence. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And like you say, it's amazing in the history of capitalism because I would say this is the first time, and we've discussed this before, but I would say this is the first time someone's made a piece of code, a platform that perfectly represents in the digital world what the free market is. We've never seen anything like that, where a free market basically has some mechanism to trade, and that's kind of the energy of the incentive mechanism. And then there are things to trade. There are people who have, too much of something, and other people need that extra supply in order to create what they are going to create. So, for instance, Targon has spare compute, so they're able to rent those resources to people who want to build an AI model in another subnet, for instance. And the Tao incentive mechanism allows all these things to flow through the platform. You can think of Tao as a currency in that case, but really it's more just a way of, it's almost like a barter. It's more just a way of providing a way for the transaction to happen rather than thinking of it as, oh, I'm going to use my Tao to buy a cup of coffee. But this is really just to keep all the incentives aligned. It's very fascinating. And the thing is, with this big AI, I don't want to call it a bubble, but there are two things about like the OpenAIs and the Geminis and the Anthropics of the world. They're catering to the VC need. People have to understand how venture capital firms work on the whole. There are many exceptions, yours included, but venture capitalists make money by taking a 20% of profits. Now, what are profits? Well, a profit might be when a company sells, but it also might mean when a company has a higher valuation. So if I'm a venture capitalist and I invest in OpenAI when it's worth 10 billion, and then tomorrow it's worth $100 billion. It's not sold yet, but there's a secondary market for those shares. I can get I can take enormous fees, 20% profit. That means 18 billion in fees I'm taking that year. So it's to everyone's, it's a little, I don't want to call it like a mafia, but you could almost think of it like an organized, you know, shady activity. Hey, let's all get together and do the next round at 100 billion on December 31st, because January 1st is when we're going to get paid our 20% fees. And then what happens? Okay, all these guys are friends with Nvidia, Oracle, Google. So let's orchestrate, oh, Oracle's going to invest so much money in OpenAI, and then OpenAI is going to buy, data centers, $100 billion worth of data centers from Oracle. It's kind of this circle jerk that inflates the value of everything. It's very similar to what happened, but actually to a much larger extent, very similar to 1999 when, Cisco, Pets.com, all the VCs then, everything was kind of trading at huge valuations. Then it collapsed because there were no users. The difference here, there are users. But to your point, JJ, you don't have to bet on a collapse to make money here. You have to bet on you have to ask yourself, what entity is organically building real companies that are undervalued? Again, Ridge with a $200 million market cap versus Anthropic with an almost $200 billion market cap. So there's an arbitrage. Buy organically growing companies, never VC funded. So the valuation is closer to truth than the VC funded valuations. And that's how you can make an enormous amount of money. And the problem is the news doesn't, to several problems. One is there's not enough news about Tao and Bittensor. You can't go on CoinDesk or the Wall Street Journal and read about Tao. It's one of the reasons why we're doing the Tao Pod here, and another reason why I did the TaoDaily.com. So it's just so the news will happen and it'll start to grow. It's just a little slower than the $100 billion VC funded companies. Another problem is, as you were saying, it's hard to buy the subnet tokens directly. Anybody listening to this who's an investor should always think of problems as opportunities, because either the problems don't get solved and then everything goes down, or the problems do get solved and then everything goes up. And if you think the latter is more likely, it's a good investment. And yes, JJ's building a bridge. Other people are building bridges. Other exchanges are listing the subnets. The subnets are breaking out. This is a problem that's, if I were to bet, which I am betting pretty big, this is a problem that is going to get solved.
Yeah, I think there's so many different things to understand about Bittensor, and the world, I feel, still has a reluctance to think critically about anything with a crypto association because of the sort of conventional chaos and scamminess and sort of volatility track record of crypto writ large. And I would propose a good way of really kind of having a more clear way of reasoning here would be to sort of detach the crypto label from Bittensor. And in the same way that you can kind of think about Bitcoin more clearly in the absence of crypto, right? Like Bitcoin is its own thing. It's obviously part of crypto and kind of created this whole movement. Crypto wouldn't exist without Bitcoin, in the same way that open source wouldn't maybe exist in the same way without Linux, as a sort of the first major successful example of a huge ecosystem that really set the stage for how you do governance and how you do development and how you ship stuff and get people involved and talk about the ideology and the philosophy and all these things. But in many ways, Bitcoin isn't crypto. It's its own sort of technology that was built to solve a very specific problem and has actually succeeded and continues to succeed more and more. And it does it in its own way. And I think Bittensor is very similar vis-a-vis everything that came after Bitcoin and up to Bittensor. Sort of like Bittensor is its own organism or its own technology, and it should almost be detached entirely from crypto and sort of viewed as a sort of like fundamental invention or discovery that allows for sort of a reshaping of the way economic incentives are created and utilized by people. And it's a super profound thing. And we talk a lot about the sort of the broader narratives and stuff, but like, I was asked by someone at the end of a talk I was giving in DC a couple weeks ago at NVIDIA's GTC conference. And this gentleman was asking, we're going to be in a world where, there's all this abundance and there's all this like automation. What about the, 2 or 3 billion people that are sort of left out of the equation in terms of like being able to contribute and participate and really, benefit from the economic aspects of things, because we're seeing more and more wealth concentration. Things are pretty obvious to everybody. Elon's probably going to be multi-trillionaire. There's probably going to be many trillionaires, actually. It's probably not just going to be one trillionaire. And so like, it's going to be more mega billionaires, more trillionaires, probably fewer of the broader writ large universe of people at that level of wealth. And so my answer to this guy was like, yeah, I think we need to kind of, from first principles, like reimagine the world of capitalism with different constraints. And I think Bitcoin inspired Bittensor. And so it really should just be viewed as almost its own derivative technology using the same ideas that Bitcoin applies in terms of reinventing money, reinventing capital. Bittensor does this for reinventing incentives and reinventing capitalism. And once you grok this and you start to sort of look deeper, peel the onion back on the progress that Bittensor's made over the last 3 or 4 years, it is immense, the rate of progress. And there's really nothing like it. There are no other ecosystems that come close to the rate of progress that Bittensor has incentivized permissionlessly in the world. Something that Jake Steeves, the co-founder of Bittensor, goes by Const, was pointing out a week or so ago. It's actually a really good way of understanding how profound Bittensor is. It's the only blockchain or cryptocurrency, or you want to call it permissionless digital ledger-based technology that has incentivized non-financial utilities successfully at scale, right? So what does that mean? Well, Bittensor is the only technology that has incentivized non-financial utility at scale. So what is non-financial utility? Well, it's something like inference compute or prediction models or synthetic data, right? Or coding models. These are non-financial products, infrastructure technologies that are basically reshaping the way humans make progress and the way that we learn and the way that we build experiences for other humans and the way that we shape our companies and organize society. And obviously AI is kind of a makeup of those things: inference, compute, data, algorithms. And those are non-financial utilities, non-financial commodities. And Bittensor is successfully incentivizing extrinsically, with the kind of economic incentive, the production of those commodities. And for the first time ever in the history of any application of cryptocurrency has that been done successfully, and Bittensor is doing it. All other cryptocurrencies or all other blockchain products incentivize financial contract-based utilities. So if you look at the Ethereum ecosystem or the Solana ecosystem or these kinds of projects, also all stable coins, right? So stable coins, smart contract blockchains, DeFi, right? The common denominator across all of those networks is that they are incentivizing financial products and services, purely financial, right? Where Bittensor is actually allowing you to incentivize useful, abstract technology improvement in the world. This is a profoundly different category of incentive.
You're totally right. So it's, first off, I like the idea, and this is going to happen, of let's just get rid of the phrase cryptocurrency, or particularly the crypto part. You don't go around saying, oh, Amazon and Uber are two TCP/IP companies. You don't say that. You don't even say that they're internet companies. They're just companies. Bitcoin is a store of value. In many cases, it's a currency. And Bittensor is like, if you go down the top 100 cryptos, I'm looking at them now. Bitcoin, currency. Ethereum, essentially a programming language to make decentralized finance applications. Tether, a currency. XRP, a currency. BNB, financial exchange. Solana, kind of a currency. or kind of like Ethereum, USDC, a currency, and on and on. They're all hyperliquid. It's an exchange to do derivatives trading. Chainlink powers stablecoin transactions, among other things, and on and on. Bitcoin Cash, Zcash, these are all DeFi apps. And then finally, down on the list of the top 100, you get to number 30 and Bittensor, the very first token in the top 100 that has nothing to do with decentralized finance. And what they do is they're creating right now. We're at kind of like the seed stage, but they're creating now some of the most amazing companies and technologies on the planet. And it should be emphasized again, these are not just AI companies. I think, I can see why the fascination with AI. Probably Jake Steves, who you mentioned, and the other founder, they probably were fascinated by AI, and AI was one of the fastest growing technologies out there at the day Bittensor was released. So why not focus on AI? But let's not forget, first off, at one end of the scale, there's Bitcast, which is an ad agency, a decentralized ad agency, supplanting the $1 trillion a year centralized ad industry. There's Better Therapy, which is has nothing to do with AI. It's therapists connecting with customers. It's like an online therapy program with more incentives than the traditional online therapy companies out there. There's at least 3 companies that have subnets that are in the cybersecurity space. So here's a platform, and the minor rewards are bug bounty. So the bug bounty business is a very successful industry, helps companies from all sizes solve their potential bugs and opportunities to hack into their systems. So there's at least 3 bug bounty subnets or cybersecurity subnets. There's the bank compliance subnet. Yanez uses AI to create data sets, but it's not really an AI company. It's more of like a company that banks would pay to see if they have the right compliance. So there's many. I would say at the end of the day, when the dust settles, there's going to be probably at least 50% or more of the subnet are going to be non-AI. Still, AI is probably the biggest growing and fastest growing, but there's Cartha, which is like a subnet, which is like a hyperliquid, Tao, which allows you to buy Tao using USDC. So there's some financial subnets as well. So it's really, think of a business this way. A business has 3 components. There's one side, which has a lot of supply of something, another side, which needs some of that supply, and a platform in the middle to help with discovery and transactions and customer help. And so it's like Uber. There's on the one side, there's people who have empty seats in their car. There on the other side, there's people who would like to be in one of those empty seats. And then the Uber is just the platform in the middle that connects the two. And what Bittensor and Tao does is it basically abstracts that platform so anybody can create a company and have built-in resources to provide incentives to mine. You don't need employees anymore. Now you have miners all over the world willing to contribute your resources. Kind of in the way artificially that Uber, you could think of Uber as the drivers are the miners, and Uber is both the validator and the platform in the middle that connects customers who need seats. So Uber is like what a subnet would look like. Bittensor abstracted that away so anybody can basically create an Uber or an Airbnb or an OpenAI, which is, OpenAI is really on one side, you have people who had great AI models, and on the other side is people who need great AI models. Oh, which is one more point I want to make on this. OpenAI has seized the public fascination, as has, Grok and DeepSeek that you were talking about earlier. But these are not in the future going to be the most important internet companies. Just like Cisco, which was the highest valued company in 1999, is no longer the most important internet company. In fact, it's barely relevant at all. OpenAI, yes, it provides a useful resource for consumers, but there are going to be niche AI companies that provide much greater value that are going to, cure cancer and stop financial fraud and do all sorts of other things that AI companies are good for. And I'll just mention the subnet Metanova, using AI to find proteins is kind of in this category of niche AI company that could be game changing for the entire planet, but is not consumers can't chat into it every day, so it's not as well known. But anyway, that was all my points.
Well, I think Google, if you think about the way humans discover information, there were 20 or 30 search engines before Google was created. And if you were
Yeah.
to say, look, we're not going to have any more innovation from startups. Startup innovation is done. No more startups. Just call it a day, everybody. Stop doing your startup. Google probably wouldn't have been given the confidence or the success or the capital that they ultimately produced massive amounts of if that was the narrative, right? If that was in the air in the early 90s, because we had Metacrawler. I mean, you probably remember this. I mean, I think you've started a few internet companies, James,
Yeah.
Metacrawler, Alta Vista, Ask Jeeves, right? Like early internet companies.
There was EINet Galaxy, which was a weird search engine that AOL was using. And then, of course, there was the very first one created by, I think it was Tim Berners-Lee, which was the World Wide Web worm.
Tell me about the World Wide Web worm. What was that one about?
The basic idea was it was an open source like spider. There was
Okay.
this thing called the web, and Tim Berners-Lee created a spider that could
Okay.
crawl the web and return
Okay.
all the information on a page. It was
Wow.
the most basic search engine. So if you typed in the word motorcycles, it would simply just scan all the pages that the crawler had gathered, that the spider had gathered, and see
Yeah.
if the word motorcycles exists on that page. The more times the word appeared, the higher ranking that page would be. Whereas
Yes.
Google completely changed that approach.
Well, I think, you know, just to kind of pick up on something you mentioned, which a lot of people might interpret as just wishful thinking. JJ and James are just crazy, optimistic, pie in the sky. They think this Bittensor is going to work out and be this gigantic thing. Well, I would just say, look at the success of open source. How has open source become so dominant and so disruptive and transformative to every single category it's been successfully applied to, right? By the way, including AI, right now, the open source models are state of the art in almost every domain. And they've gotten there orders of magnitude more compute efficiently. And the dominant approach being adopted by China is to release these open models, and they are absolutely dominant. All the startups in the West, in particular the United States, are heavily using these Chinese-based open models, right? And so, but let's just look pre-AI, pre 3 years ago, right? Pre-November, December 2022, because we're now in November of 2025. Open source has also been very dominant rapidly in every area it is applied to. And you can just look at the trend line. The proprietary incumbent approaches to creating technology eventually wane and get fully replaced by the open source approaches. And I've been building my career on this thesis. I think it's empirically true. If you study the world and technology markets going back many decades, and infrastructure software tends to be the most obvious place. You have Linux with operating systems, you have open source databases, and you have many middleware infrastructure tools. And I think this is happening gradually more and more with applications. But BitTensor transforms open source. It basically says, we're doing the same thing. We're using the power of the internet and the global potential of humanity dispersed across all these different places. It doesn't matter where you live. You could be in Zimbabwe, you can be in Canada and South America, anywhere on the planet, or maybe other planets when we start colonizing other planets, right? And you can participate in moving humanity forward. You basically just have to mine this permissionless decentralized network, and you're rewarded commensurately for doing so. And as a result, you are then given the freedom to be your own boss and to not go and work for a company, or perhaps even to create your own company. In many ways, being a miner on BitTensor successfully means that you actually never even really need to operate within the conventional equity-based capitalist system, because you're actually rewarded with direct incentive as opposed to this indirect incentive where it's getting inflated away and you're getting diluted. And also you have to abide, in terms of the world of equity, you have to abide within the laws of the country that you created the equity in. A lot of people,
Yeah.
quickly confront these things when they choose to become equity-based entrepreneurs. And capitalists, well, if you incorporate your company in America, you're typically going to choose a place like Delaware, and you're operating within the Delaware court system, right? If you just delegate all these things to a lawyer and you don't really care about what you're doing at the implementation detail level, you might not actually realize what you're stepping into. But your business is literally governed by someone else, even if you own 100% of your business. The cool thing about a permissionless network like Bittensor or Bitcoin is that your incentive is not governed by someone else. It is influenced and controlled by algorithms that are mathematically predefined, and where the network itself is fully decentralized and not controlled by any single entity. That's pretty awesome. And that's what gives Bitcoin the resilience it's earned and developed into over 17 years. And I believe that's the trend line for Bittensor. But, we just have to continue to see more evidence, to your point, of state-of-the-art, very successful subnets out-competing, out-innovating the proprietary, centralized, highly permissioned, and in almost all cases, heavily venture capital subsidized incumbents. And we're going to continue to see more and more people understand and realize that Bittensor is a very legitimate and extremely scalable path to continuing to accelerate the pace of human progress and AI. And I guess another thing that I think more people will also realize, right, especially as Anthropic and OpenAI become more and more dominant, which I do expect to continue to happen as well. I announced a week or so ago that you can no longer ask medical questions and you can no longer ask for financial advice.
You're kidding.
I'm pretty sure a lot of consumers really want to be able to talk to their model about some medical advice, maybe with some disclosures and disclaimers is okay. And I'm pretty sure they would also like to ask their models for financial advice on different topics as well, right? And so more and more, what I think will be the default position of Anthropic and OpenAI and all the leading proprietary closed models that really want to become what Google is to search over the last 25 years is that they will become more and more politicized. They'll become more and more woke, more and more politically correct, more and more lobotomized, brainwashed, and narrow-minded in topics that are popular for the mainstream that will further entrench those incumbents. And I think that the reality is, as people try the open models, as people become more aware of how do you systematically build AI that can actually be far more disruptive and transformative because it's built by the collective of humanity as opposed to 20 people in Palo Alto or 50 people in San Francisco and thousands of unnecessary headcount. That's really, at the end of the day, there's like 50 to 100 people that do the vast majority of the core fundamental work at these labs. And there's thousands of people there that work there that are really just filler. And it's just kind of unnecessary, in my opinion. I mean, they're probably building data centers, they're labeling training data and doing things, but they really probably don't need to be full-time employees because you go through these like cycles of training the model, and then you release it, you do red teaming, and then you're running inference. And then at that point, you're just running inference at a large scale for serving the prompts, for the API queries and the prompts by consumers on mobile apps or on their desktop or whatever. And so I think the more people realize that like these models are getting heavily censored, the more people will start to look for alternatives. And I think that that's going to be a more powerful dislocation for sort of like resetting the fundamental economics of this AI transition that humanity is going through in terms of markets, far more so than, there's a lot of overpriced assets. There's a lot of venture capital exuberance. There's a lot of overspending. I think that's actually going to be more disruptive than the sort of like overinvestment and glut of overspending going on the infrastructure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and look, you bring up a really good point about how open source is like the basis for so many of these trillion-dollar industries. Like, it's almost like AI right now with the open AIs, and I think we're being almost overly critical of these big, gigantic AI valuations, but the reality is we're dead on correct. But it's almost like AI has done it in reverse. Let's create the big valuation and then build into it. Whereas, think about the internet, started off as something nobody cared about, then it went into, oh, this is useful to send messages back and forth. Oh, here's a web browser. And it actually earned its value over the decades. And And same thing with Linux, you know, and same thing with all the GNU, Richard Stallman, projects. But if you think of it, there's a big difference though between open source and BitTensor, which I think is really important. If you look at all the creators of these open source industries, like let's take Linus Torvalds at who created Linux, so many trillions of dollars in value have created off Linux. Both the Windows operating system and the Mac operating system are based on Linux. But it's not like Linus Torvalds is worth trillions of dollars. He was, I forget what happened. He was basically, did he become like a Google, scholar
Well,
or
actually,
some,
no. My friend Jim Zemlin, who was a marketing executive working at a open source company for Apache web server, realized in 2004 or maybe 2005 that Linus should have been compensated more and sort of provided with a structure. And Linus didn't really care too much about capturing all this value. He cared more about creating a lot of
sure,
value. Linus ended up partnering up with Jim to help create the Linux Foundation. And so the Linux Foundation became very successful, and it's a great foundation. They've created a lot of kind of standards and ecosystem investment in open source over the years. And, they generate something like on the order of $200 or $300 million a year in revenue. It's a very profitable nonprofit, as many nonprofits are, in case people aren't aware. And so I believe Linus is paid $7 to $10 million a year from the payroll of that foundation. And he's
so
been paid that for something like 15 years or so, which is great. No, but again,
yeah,
you look at the value that Linus helped contribute to the technology industry. By the way, not just with Linux, with Git, which Linus also built, which is a versioning system for how you actually version software. Because he's a very antisocial person. So he's like, I want to create a better protocol and a mechanism for how we version files for software code. And he created Git to basically make that more systematic. Also was motivated to do that because the previous version control system used by the Linux community was proprietary. And I believe it was called BitKeeper or forget the name. It was another version control system that was actually closed source. He was like, we need to build an open source one, of course, because why is Linux, the dominant open source project using a proprietary version control system? But Linus really, if you look at, even if he had 1% of the equity of GitHub, GitLab, Red Hat, all the Linux companies, he'd probably be a billionaire just with 1% of the ownership
sure.
of those companies.
And this is my point though, that okay, he would have had to work that out for himself. By the way, Mosaic, the first web browser that allowed graphic displays, created by a young college student named Mark Andreessen, he also had to create for himself a separate entity, a separate company by which he started making his millions. That was Netscape, and of course now he runs Andreessen Horowitz, the big VC firm. And similarly, Tim Berners-Lee, he didn't make a company about the web, or else he'd be worth like $30 trillion or whatever. But he was rewarded in some artificial way. Somebody compensated. I think this one might have been Google gave him some reward or whatever. But with BitTensor, with Tao, it's open source, but there is financial incentives. There is reasons why a subnet would want to go on Tao and BitTensor. There is a reason why miners would want to mine the subnets because they get rewarded either in Tao or in tokens denominated in Tao. And Tao has intrinsic value. Yes, it's open source like all these quote unquote crypto tokens, but Tao has value because you need to buy Tao in order to register a subnet. You need, in some cases, to buy Tao, I think, to be a validator or a miner. I forget which one. You need to buy, as we spoke about earlier, you need to buy Tao to buy the subnet tokens of the subnets. And that is sort of a replacement, as we've discussed in other episodes, that's a replacement for the buying equity in these subnets. So there's huge, enormous reasons why the platform gets denominated in tokens where there's legitimate buying pressure. There are reasons to buy Tao. It's not a meme coin. There are people who need to buy Tao to perform certain tasks. And so that as the value of Tao goes up, it's this flywheel where as the value of the Tao goes up, it becomes more attractive to register a subnet. It becomes more attractive to become a miner. It becomes more attractive to buy subnets, which in turn creates more buying pressure on Tao. So here's this amazing thing where it's this open source platform for creating, it's an open source platform for general entrepreneurship that many companies are launching off of, and the ways in which to transact in any way on this network is through a token that is rising in value, which further creates and escalates the incentives to participate in it.
Yes.
That's why it's an amazing thing. It's open source 2.0 because it's this evolution
Yes.
from the last 3 decades of.
I fully agree. But something that you mentioned makes me want to add a bit to it, which is it's an opt-in system. You have to decide to participate. You're not born with Tao, right?
Right.
You need to wake up one day, listen to the Tao Pod by James
Yeah.
Altucher and Joseph Jacks, and you need to learn and educate yourself. And you need to have an open mind and have an intellectually curious mind to really kind of like unlearn and reset the conventional wisdom of going through business school, learning most basic concepts of capitalism from an early age, and sort of never really questioning those things. I think education is the most fundamental and important thing that is really representing the barrier between mainstream understanding and adoption of what Bittensor represents in terms of its disruptive potential, its transformative potential, and the people that are going to stay stuck in the conventional capitalist system.
Such an important point. Such an important point, because when I talk to people not only about Bittensor but Bitcoin, they're stuck. Not what quite. Everybody wants to think that the system, oh, it's been around for 100 years. It's got to be correct. It's got to be perfect. People need to understand there are every industry on the planet evolves, including the financial system, including entrepreneurship, and so on. But people need to understand there are, as good as banks are for us, we keep our money there, we can use credit cards, we get interest, but you need to understand structurally and culturally the flaws of banks and the banking system in order to really appreciate what an innovation Bitcoin is, for instance.
Yeah.
And with entrepreneurship, you need to understand, we discussed in the last episode what the word permissionless means. This is just part of it, but you need to understand what the flaws are in starting a company in the US or in any country. And the VC funded model and the public markets model, they're not really public markets. They're just called that. It's not really for the general public. VCs don't really take venture style risk. A lot of it is baked in and very scammy. So you need to understand what the flaws are instead of just buying into the system. And you're right, it does take education as well as these financial systems. I think that's a very important point.
Yeah, people, when they first encounter Bittensor and they start hearing, wow, it's kind of reinventing equity, company equity. Wow, it's reinventing the way we do AI, training and compute and building out all these technologies, incentivizing them. What are incentives? We have intrinsic incentives, we have extrinsic incentives. There's all these concepts. And what I would just say is we're living in a moment where everything is changing, where the way humans are going to coordinate between each other is going to change in massive ways. The way value is going to be represented is changing rapidly. And the
Yes.
way, and something Ray Dalio has been talking about the reorganization of power in the world and sort of the new world order. I'm a big fan of what he's been talking about on those lines for many years now. I think there's going to be new power structures in the world at the government level, at individual levels. And I think if you're not educating yourself very seriously and questioning the sort of structure of the existing systems, you're going to be left out. And I think that that's a really critical thing. Something I proposed, which I really hope we can kind of make progress on at some point, and maybe hoping is not the right way to do it. Maybe we just have to be systematic and figure out how to make this happen, James. But if every human who had some ability to dollar cost average buy Tao at a level of $5 or $10 a month, something nominal, we would be able to include all of humanity in this system. And I would wager there's about 1 billion people on the planet that could afford to do that. And so, if we did that at a level of, call it $5 or $10 billion a month, that's 1 billion people times $5 is 5 billion a month. Let's say it's 10 billion a month. It's 120 billion a year. It's really actually not enough. We need more than that. But I think that would be probably a quarter or maybe 20% of what we really need to accelerate at the level of capital investment by Google, Amazon, Apple, Tesla, et cetera, Microsoft combined, which is, they're investing almost $1 trillion a year combined. And next year will be $1 trillion a year, right? And the sum total of humanity coming together and doing that, at least the people that can afford to do it, which is probably around 1 billion knowledge workers, right? The people who make, enough to like sort of say you have spare income of probably $100 or $200 a month at least, maybe even more than that. Call it 10% of your spare income. Dollar cost average by Tao. It'll be a great store of value and a way in which you can actually include yourself and your future generations in permissionless, open, continuously improving intelligence and uncensorable, permissionless, meaning borderless, meaning it's not controlled by a single government or entity or corporation. And it's probably the best, highest value long-term investment you can possibly make. Like what's the ceiling on the value you want to put on continuously improving, open, permissionless knowledge, intelligence for the future of humanity? There's no price. You can't put a price on that.
I was just thinking as you were saying this, I have the beginnings of a solution to how you, I don't want to say extract this money, but again, everything boils down to incentives. What's the incentive by which someone should do this? So imagine I have a kid. I have several kids, but imagine I have one kid and I'm given the choice. The goal is you want your kid to have the best education possible. And so I have two choices: send the kid to Harvard, or he spends 4 years, and during those 4 years, he has to be a miner for one or two subnets. He has to be a validator, and he has to build a subnet. That I would always choose the latter, because you're going to get such an education in entrepreneurship, in incentives, in negotiation, in pricing, not all in economics, because there's many economics issues
Game theory,
completely game theory. By the way, many of the subnet owners, 50% of their time is thinking about how to deal with people trying to exploit their incentive mechanisms.
Yes.
So you have to think about game theory all the time. And that's the real world. They never teach you about exploits and corrupt businessmen in college. It's all an idealistic world in college. So building a subnet, being a miner for, let's say, 1 to 3 subnets, being a validator for subnets, you're going to learn coding, you're going to learn technology, you're going to learn economics, you're going to learn incentives, you're going to learn management, game theory. You're going to get such a great real world education. Tao University, someone should set up Tao University to basically, explain to people the benefits, and maybe we could do this, but explain to people the benefits of doing these activities on Tao. My kid will be so much more successful if I put him through Tao University than if I send him to Harvard, where, okay, he'll get good connections, but that lasts for so long. Without skills, you're nothing. These are the skills you'll learn from the ages of 18 to 22 when the mind is still molding. You're going to be so far ahead of everyone who didn't learn those skills between 18 to 22. Like, that's how, and then, okay, if you want to go through the program and be a certified Tao University graduate, then that's $5 a month, $10 a month, and you get a better education than spending, $80,000 a year at Harvard.
I think it's already there. You register some Tao, you lock it into a subnet, and then if you're successfully mining, your ROI on that is immense, but you do have to put up some investment. I think Bittensor is continuously improving curriculum that requires you to learn a wide range of topics, like you said: technology, game theory, community development, communication, navigating the scammy things from the things that are actually creating and producing value and real utility. And those skills, you're getting paid and rewarded to do that. It's sort of like a paid university degree that never ends, that it's a lifelong thing, as opposed to going and getting massively in debt and getting politicized, regurgitated memorization of tests and then getting a score that is, for all intents and purposes, a very poor representation of your life potential, a very, very lacking indicator of your success. I know a lot of people that have degrees from these elite universities, and many of them are some of the least impressive people I've ever met in my entire life. Some of them are really amazing, for sure. I'm not going to say all of them. A lot of them are really awesome people, but many of them, they got the same degrees and they studied the same topics. And I'm like, wow, something's probably not working there.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think I first wrote about colleges being, dead in 2005 for the Financial Times. And back then it wasn't a conversation. Like, people were very upset at me. I think now it's a legit conversation to be having with your children, and it's more widely accepted. And I think platforms like Tao, where it's so clear you get this worldview education
Yeah.
from business models to economic, all the things we discussed. I think this will create a more educated society the more people participate in this kind of ecosystem. It's very exciting.
I would say many of the youngest people, just to top this
Yeah.
off, because I think what you said is so important. Many of the youngest people in the Bittensor project, they could be miners, they could be subnet owners. They are really brilliant people. They're super uber geniuses. A lot of the same people I know, but they're teenagers. Some of them are not adults even. Some of them are
Yeah.
15, 16, 17 years old. And they're incredibly brilliant because they get it. They came from a video gaming background, or they were really into programming competitions or something. And they're just sort of like autistic and really into all of the economic angles of BitTensor sort of incentivizing things. And they get it so fast, much faster than I did. When I learned about BitTensor in early 23, and then I didn't really get it. It took me a year to fully comprehend everything as it was still evolving. And many of the much younger people that I'm now fortunate to know and work with and consider many of them friends, for whatever reason, they got it so much faster than I did. And I think it just requires that kind of fluidity of understanding things and not being encumbered by all this conventional wisdom.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I remember it was just in June. We met at, I think it was like June 3rd, the beginning of Proof of Talk, the conference in Paris.
Yep.
And you and I met for breakfast. You were the first person really in the ecosystem I was meeting face to face. That meeting, and then just the rest of the conference, and then all the experiences I've had since. This is like a really smart, this is a high IQ group of people. Like all the subnets, all the people involved. I feel just grateful. Like I've had such a great
Me too.
education talking to all of these people is geniuses. And
Yeah.
now, and I'm going to take advantage of that genius again, which I want to ask you a more in the weeds question now. We discussed this briefly on text this week, but this new, and this is really in the weeds, so people could pay attention or not, but this new idea of allocating Tau to subnets through the net flows. I understand conceptually. So every day or every block, Tau is allocated to subnets based on how good they are. And they would measure how good they are previously by what the price of the subnet was. Now it's being measured, and I think this is correct. Now it's being measured by how many people are interested in staking in that subnet, because that shows longer term beliefs in that subnet. So that subnet is potentially worthy of more Tau being allocated to it to pay miners and have less volatility and so on. But what I want to understand better is, will this penalize the subnets where the miners are using more expensive resources, so are inclined to sell their rewards, their subnet tokens, a little bit more quickly versus the subnets where the miners are more incentivized to stake their rewards rather than sell the rewards to pay their bills?
I would argue that you have to ask the question slightly differently, because I think there's ways in which the answer could be yes in both cases, depending on which subnet you ask the question about. So I think what you were texting me about, and I kind of gave you my off the cuff answer, which maybe needs a little bit of revision, but for pure commodity subnets where you're just incentivizing inference tokens, or maybe you're incentivizing data, training data of some kind that's like fairly trivial to acquire. Maybe you're scraping Twitter, maybe you're scraping Reddit or something, or you're incentivizing compute resources, maybe like very abundant H100s or AA100s or something. Maybe not Blackwells, but like more widely available compute. I think you could make the case that Tau flow requires those subnets to have slightly different incentive mechanism designs in terms of how the validation works versus subnets that have less commoditized outputs, where you're really incentivizing something that is already inherently very scarce, and you need a less rigorous incentive mechanism design, because it's just like, look, just give me this thing, and the world has very little of it, and so it's pretty easy to measure that you provided that thing, right, depending on how it's actually produced. So the abstract way I've been sort of thinking about Tau flow, which I'm a fan of, I think it's a good protocol upgrade, and I think it does basically acknowledge the scarceness of Tau. There's 21 million Tau. Now it's getting emitted as of basically a month from now. It's going to be emitted at half the amount it has been for the last 4+ years. which is 7,200 Tao per day. So we're going to be going down to half of that, which means everyone in the ecosystem is going to need to sort of understand that their incentive design has to be that much more precise at a minimum, right? Like you need to get far more clear on how you verify and validate that the work and the production of the work was done in a way that cannot be exploited or hacked or manipulated. This is a big problem. Exploitation and what I would call value leakage across almost all the subnets is definitely an issue. I would make a couple of comments about how to mitigate this. Tao flow is definitely one step in the right direction. Another thing I think that we need, which I think is going to be a big next phase of refinement for Bittensor's protocol, is the degree to which you can basically be more precise and expressive about how to allocate the emission and the Tao to the people who participate in creating your commodity, your subnet output. And so, by the way, primarily very, very obvious who those people are. It starts with an M, it's the miners, right? No surprise. People who are doing the work should be rewarded with most of the incentive, right? Today, there's a pretty common standard across all the subnets where the subnet owner gets 18%, the validators get 41%, the miners get 41%. So 18, 41, 41, right? A lot of reasons why validators might not actually get paid 41. There might be different reductions in that, or there might be burning or redistribution of that back to the miners. And so, but in a lot of cases, the miners are not getting rewarded more than, let's say, 50, 60% of the total emission going into a subnet, right? And so as of today, right, before the first halving next month, let's say you're getting 1% of the Tau emission, which would be around 70 Tau per day, 70 Tau per day. If your miners are really only getting about 60% of that per day, right? Like that means that the protocol has a sort of upper bound on what the miners can directly be paid based on the emission percentage, right? That stakers are actually increasing. So if you stake more into a subnet in an available liquid supply of Tau, the higher up the rankings on emissions that subnet will go. They're going to earn more emission. But the big thing that I've been trying to kind of unpack recently is as subnets become more and more clear on how to measure the value of the commodity, of the output from the subnet, what they should really start to internalize. I believe this is a journey. I don't think it's a binary thing. I think this is very important for people to understand. It's not like we're going to figure this out tomorrow. We're going to figure this out next week or next year. I think this is going to take some time, but they need to understand that they should aspire to be like Bitcoin. They should aspire to have the same degree of measurement precision that Bitcoin has in rewarding the miners on Bitcoin. And so let's look at Bitcoin just as a case study and an example, because Bittensor was modeled and designed 100% after Bitcoin in terms of the fundamental architecture, right? The fair launch, token supply constraint, emission schedule, halvings, lots of attributes. Bittensor extended on that and embraced proof of stake, where you basically have stake-weighted allocation and rankings of the way subnets are actually organized and the way emissions flow, right? And so there's a proof of stake, proof of work hybrid. But if you really just look at Bitcoin and the one incentive mechanism that it has, which is rewarding people to compute a SHA-256 hash, not people, but the machines that people can organize, these ASICs, right, that compute the SHA-256. When you show the proof of the hash to the network and it propagates, there is no ambiguity that the work was done. It is 100% cryptographically certain that miner who might own one ASIC or 50,000 ASICs, doesn't matter, organized those machines off of the network to compute that amount of SHA-256 hashing, and they demonstrated by showing the hash proof to the network, and if it computes successfully in Nakamoto consensus, which is a deterministic measure of did it actually reach below the difficulty threshold of that block height, you then get rewarded in Bitcoin, right? It is a deterministic, cryptographically airtight incentive mechanism with no exploitation potential. You cannot exploit that. The only way you'd be able to do an exploit is if you did what's called a Sybil attack on Bitcoin's network, which is where if you controlled more than 51% of the hash rate, and then you could actually manipulate the coin base. You could print more Bitcoin. You could delete tokens. You could distribute more. You can change supply. You can do all kinds of things. And that would be obviously catastrophic. What Satoshi had predicted in the Bitcoin white paper was that there would be a disincentive to actually manipulate the network if a 51% attack were ever possible by the attacker, because they would have a higher incentive to mine the network fairly than they would to actually take over the network, because they would be rewarded and paid more to just mine the network as opposed to undermining all of the other
Right.
tokens.
The price would plummet if everybody
plummet.
thought that it was attacked.
Yes. And so you can also coordinate Sybil attacks with several entities. But Bittensor's network has a subjective or fuzzy verification design, which is, how do you create continuously improving intelligence? Well, it's kind of hard to measure that with a cryptographic hash that's perfectly precise. But I would actually argue we should attempt to go more in this direction. I think a lot of the subnets are computational in nature, where you're producing some inference tokens or you're producing some training data or you're training models from scratch. And these are computational processes. And I believe that actually is possible to reach a point in time where we can really more closely mirror the symmetry of economics on Bitcoin, which is, by the way, there are no separate validators that are paid to validate Bitcoin blocks. Miners validate through the process of mining on Bitcoin, right? There are full nodes that validate Bitcoin transactions. They are paid zero. They get 0% of the Bitcoin emission. 100% of the Bitcoin emission goes to miners that are presenting proof of the SHA-256 hashing that happened on some machines that those miners organized. 100%. And by the way, Satoshi, again, there's no pre-mine. There's no 18% allocated to Satoshi. So what I think, my big grand prediction, I'll just put it here, posted a tweet about this a few days ago, is I think in the next year or two, we're going to start to see early signs of ranking the most long-term durable and disruptive subnets on Bittensor is when they start to look like Bitcoin, when the owner percentage goes to zero, when the burning and the recycling of tokens stops to occur, because you don't need to do that. Your incentive mechanism is perfectly precisely measuring something where the percentage of emission you're getting from Tao itself, the overall Tao network, starts to become the real price reflection of the value of your subnet and the commodity that your subnet's producing. And validation is part of the mining process. Why do we have separate validators? Why would we need to have separate validators? If in the process of mining, you have so precisely measured that check and proof of the miner's contribution also verifies that the work meets the standard of quality in some increasing difficulty threshold, right? Function. You don't need a third party or a separate persona to do the validation. You can do it in the same process. Therefore, the miners would be paid 100% of the emission, 100% of the incentive. That's where I think things will eventually go. Again, it's not going to be, to reiterate, it's not going to be an overnight thing. It's not going to happen in a week or two. It's not going to maybe even happen in a year or two. I think it's a gradual process where, again, the indicators, what I would argue would be, the indicators would be margin compression on the subnet take rate, significant margin compression on the validator take rate, and margin expansion and increasing saturation to the point of being fully saturated of miner take rate of the emission going into the subnet.
But the question is, like, while that's happening, while that process is happening, which figures out how to reward miners more substantially,
Yes.
What's going to happen when we're fully in this new net flows model where, like, take the subnets that provide compute.
Yeah.
Those miners have electricity bills the next day that they have to pay.
Sure.
And so they have to sell, just like with Bitcoin miners, they have to sell some proportion of their in tokens that they've earned through incentives to pay their utility bills. But there are some subnets in the Tao ecosystem that don't have electricity bills, that don't have to pay for their resources. Their mining is maybe more intellectual. Are those subnets going to benefit more from this net flows model, and the compute subnets or inference subnets, are they going to be hurt right away?
Potentially, but I think it's a temporary transition based on how well priced that commodity is, and importantly, how well priced the derivative prerequisites for producing that commodity are, right? So for example, to produce the current block height difficulty of SHA-256 hashing on Bitcoin, you need quite a lot of electricity to do that. You need a lot of power and cooling for the machines that are going to be running that hashing. And you need a shit ton of electricity to be able to support that. What's interesting about Bitcoin is it's actually a mechanistic pricing market for the cost of both designing the chips to do the hashing and to run them and to pay for the electricity to run them, and sort of like vertically integrate a single product that's perfectly priced on that. Interestingly, you can run the math on this in terms of the cost per terahash relative to the cost per joule, the electricity cost per joule. And there's lots of statistics for Bitcoin mining out there that cover this. And I think it's almost exactly perfectly pricing. Like you basically sell the Bitcoin and you'll pay for exactly what it would cost to produce enough wattage, electricity, and hardware to earn a block of Bitcoin. Now, what's missing in that, though, is the degree to which Bitcoin is representing capital, right? If that happens faster, if the velocity of the re-representation of capital eclipses or outweighs the velocity of pricing electricity and pricing ASICs to secure and represent that capital, which is SHA-256 hashing block height, you'll then have an asymmetric differential of the value of Bitcoin per, sort of unit of electricity needed to produce a block, right? And that, by the way, that happens quite regularly, which is why a lot of the big Bitcoin miners go and say, okay, look, we think that that's actually going to be a trend, that basically the absorption potential of Bitcoin of all other capital assets will happen at a faster rate than Bitcoin can perfectly precisely price the cost of doing the mining. That what the big Bitcoin miners have done as a consequence of that conclusion, which is kind of like a speculation, is they get a lot of debt and they say, we're going to get all the tons of mountains of debt and never sell the Bitcoin because we think the Bitcoin's going to be worth so much more in the future. And unfortunately, because of the degree of volatility of the Bitcoin price, the timing has been off on that. And many of those big miners have had to sell. Many of them have not gone out of business. Some of them have gone out of business, but a lot of them have had to sell some amount of the Bitcoin to pay for the facilities for the debt or to pay for, margins that they needed to reach or whatever. And so I think to your point, it is true for certain more expensive commodities on Bittensor. It's going to be more difficult for those subnets to really scale. But I would actually argue, right? And this is kind of the way to really look at it. If you think from first principles, like Elon does with his businesses, about how to design something using the absolute highest potential, most fundamentally well-engineered design constraints and organizations of atoms and materials, right? You can make almost anything 10 times cheaper, 100 times cheaper, maybe even 1,000 times cheaper. If you work and you say the only boundary and the only playbook and rulebook we're looking at is the laws of physics. If the laws of physics allow for it, can we re-engineer and reorganize the atoms, the atomic organization of things that create a product more cost efficiently than that product is currently made today? That's really what Bittensor is all about. It's saying we are incentivizing permissionlessly economic incentive for people to create the same products and services used by humanity writ large within the laws of physics. The reason Elon's businesses are so successful, even though he's using fiat and equities to represent his businesses, is the guy thinks from first principles for breakfast. He wakes up every day and he's like, yep, that's the way we're going to do everything that way. Most people don't think this way. It's really hard for most people to think purely from first principles in terms of how to engineer things. But Bittensor kind of says like, well, you're not going to succeed as a miner unless you're actually doing something from as close to first principles as possible today. Otherwise, another miner is going to come along, outcompete you, or another subnet that's better designed, whose incentive mechanism is better measuring the value of something at some level, will outcompete you, and then it'll just continue. And that's actually a really good thing.
So once again, you've totally changed my mind on one of these issues, because this has been the latest issue I've been worrying about. But what you're basically saying is that, yes, things are changing. And by the way, I agree with this new model. I think it's going to more correctly represent what the true value is of each subnet. But what you're saying is it also then is going to provide an incentive for miners who are competing with each other to more efficiently produce their commodity from first principles thinking. And by the way, all the subnets are asking the miners to do hard things. So it's not like it's easy for some and harder for others. It's just now there's new challenges for certain categories of miners. They have to produce more efficiently, uh, you know, per subnet token that they're getting. They have
Correct.
to produce more efficiently the commodity that they're producing, whether it's computer inference or whatever.
Yes.
So it's interesting. So it shouldn't really, in the long term or even the medium term, have an effect. Maybe
I'm
even
very
in the short.
positive. I'm very positive on it long term. I think it's situational. I think it's always for protocol level changes. You always have to ask which subnet are you assessing, the question against? Because there's a lot of subnets that are doing different things, and you have to look at how they're measuring their commodity. You have to look at what the miners are doing, how they're verifying things. But BitTensor is a sort of a permanent, infinite game of capitalism. And in the world of equity, entrepreneurs have to choose whether they're going to play a finite game or an infinite game, right? Like the best entrepreneurs choose to play infinite games, and they have to think about generational transfer. If they don't live hundreds of years, many of the best companies have to instill these principles and then future generations take over. But BitTensor doesn't have a board of directors. It doesn't have a shareholder base that's sort of taking votes on major decisions. It doesn't have this kind of bureaucracy. It says there's an incentive, you focus on the design of the incentive, and if the world values that incentive in a way that is more than the cost of producing it, that subnet's going to do extremely well because Bittensor TAO can basically subsidize it using extrinsic permissionless rewards. It's not a barter system. It's not donations. It's not some subsidy. It is pure directed incentives for continuously improving innovation. And that is extremely profound. And it's kind of like unlimited and unstoppable. Companies have to constantly grapple with this. Well, shit, who's the CEO, right? The CEO is going to be there if they're not running the company. Maybe the company dies. Governments deal with the same thing, even in China, right? Like you have a big monarch or someone who is elected maybe for whatever reason, and then they're there for 50 years. Well, if they die, there's going to be a big change in control and power because there's new policy changes. United States has it, and even in a more brittle way, every 4 years, we have this split political system where there's this bifurcation of ideology. And on one hand, you have people that want one thing and the other thing. And now the government's been shut down for almost 2 months and everyone's missing their flights and the whole country's probably going to plummet to 1% growth from what it was a couple months ago, which was probably 2 or 3%. So it's really important that BitTensor continues to refine these kinds of like minor changes that allow for the incentive distribution of Tao to be allocated in the most waste-free manner and to reduce the amount of waste. Because initially there's quite a lot of waste to get people to come in and understand how the system works. And now there's less and less waste because obviously BitTensor is becoming more valuable, right? It's becoming worth tens of billions of dollars, and then we'll get to hundreds of billions and trillions. Think about how the United States developed. At the very beginning is like the dollar was just created. And then you had like Alexander Hamilton, who was like a merchant, commodities merchant. He actually had the Bank of America, first Bank of America, and he was a banker. And then they were like, well, look, we've got to print money for the society, and we've got to create commodities and financial derivatives and products in an exchange. And New York Stock Exchange has created an enormous amount of waste. And then the government has to start grappling with being this new powerful entity on the planet. And so now we're helping other nations and we're sort of printing our currency to sort of get out of all these situations. And our currency, while the nation's economic prosperity because of private capitalism and free markets has grown from 100 billion to 50 trillion in the last 100 years, the purchasing power of our fundamental currency has dropped by 95% in the same period. It's dropped by 95%. The purchasing power of the dollar has dropped by 95% in the last 100 years. I think it's like 70 or 80% in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
This is such a sad thing. We cannot have this happen for the future of free market incentives to create permissionless technology and permissionless innovation. We need more durable fundamentals. And I think as a new emergence in the history and the timeline of money, Bitcoin has served as a really great example. It's working. It's actually working. It's 15 years old, very young. Actually, 15 years is not long, right? It's actually quite a young system. It's worth a couple $1 trillion. But we have to take ideas from this to say, is it possible to create an incentive for continuously improving digital technology and AI, but also all technology that maybe can last longer than the quarter of a millennia the United States has lasted? 250 years. Next year will be the 250th anniversary of the United States of America since 1776. And it's really not that long. If you think about it, the most powerful and influential people in the world of financial markets, including our current administration, are quite pessimistic and negative about the situation with the dollar if it fundamentally doesn't change in terms of how it's represented and traded in the world. And everyone says growth. We need growth. We need growth. But the solution is growth. We're going to get out of it by growing by 5 to 10%. AI is going to save everything. We're just going to go to the moon and, we're going to grow, 5 to 10% in the next 5 years, or 3-4% per year, compounding forever. And I have to say, James, I'm not convinced that we will be able to grow at that rate with the current structure that the nation has. I'm really not convinced.
I think this goes back to that first principles thinking, which is, okay, so let's say instead of just thinking purely in terms of, okay, this is what the American economy was doing this year, how does it need to improve? What numbers need to shift so that the stock market keeps growing? You have to reinvent what is the economy? What is the way equities are changed and valued? And this is what the crypto world has done, starting with Bitcoin, but even more so, I think, with Bittensor. We started off this podcast saying, well, what are we doing here? Are we just being overly optimistic about Tao or Bittensor and so on? And the reality is, investors have to be professional optimists. That even if you're saying, okay, I'm down on the dollar, I'm down on the current system, so that might not be the best way to get the returns I need to make myself happy or make my investors happy. So where can I be professionally optimistic? Because that is where I will get the best returns. And what we've concluded, and that's how we met each other, is that this Tao ecosystem is the place to be optimistic, and it's exciting. And I haven't been this optimistic and this excited about an investment almost in my entire career, which has spanned many decades now.
Yeah, I mean, I think to be optimistic is extremely important, but to place your optimism correctly is more important.
Yeah, right. You can't be blindly optimistic. Oh, the dollar is going to do this and that. And we don't know. We don't know that. So we have to find where what we do know is where to be. We have to, like you said, find where to stake our optimism. And that's in staking Tao.
Correct. Exactly. Well, this is a great show. Thanks again, James. I'm glad we've made it 11 shows so far.
11 episodes. Sounds good. So thanks again, JJ. And I'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.